Welcome to Personality Crisis. I am Dylan Riss, your host for this episode. We are thrilled to be welcoming back to the show from the great state of Wyoming, Mr. Gary Trauner. This is Gary's return appearance, but it's my first chance as a host of the show to get to interview him. So welcome, Gary.
Thanks, Dylan. Really a pleasure to be here and nice to meet you.
Yes. Gary is no stranger to electoral politics. He has been a candidate multiple times for high office, House and Senate in the state of Wyoming, which, because he's got a little D next to his name, was made it a little bit tricky, but he's got a lot of insight as we approach the 100-day mark until the fall elections. Gary is a veteran Democratic politician. What are you thinking as you gaze out on the electoral landscape?
I think there's opportunity. I do worry that we don't blow the opportunity that we have in front of us to make some changes. Things are pointing in the right direction, but I don't think they're as strong as they could be, and I don't think they're strong enough yet to kind of rest on our laurels in a sense.
Where do you
The last
think
100 days are when people start paying attention.
Yeah. Where do you think that Democrats are outperforming what we could hope for, and where do you think that they should be doing better than they are?
That's a pretty broad question. We've outperformed in almost every special election since the last election cycle in 2026, in 2024. So we're doing relatively well. Polling, I just noticed that in Senate polling, we're up in a whole bunch of states. I'm just going to look over, but Iowa, Georgia, North Carolina, Ohio, Tellurico in Texas, even Jackson in Maine just getting in the race. Looks like the latest poll I saw was within the margin of error, but he's up by 3 points, like 49-46 over Collins. So, those are all really, really good signs. I think the generic Democratic House ballot's looking really good. But again, most people don't pay attention until it gets really close to election time. I went door to door in my campaigns, and I can tell you this is a horrible stat to quote, but this, and it's non-statistical. It's just my experience. But like 90% of people have no clue. They don't really pay attention, and they only start focusing when it gets really close. So the question is, how do we bolster ourselves going into the final stretch? And how do we deal with the breakthrough issues? The issues that really will make regular people in their everyday lives pay attention. And that's a challenge, right? You don't know what those are going to be.
Well, I think there's been some debate among political consultants or people who are very tuned in about what those issues are. Are they local issues? Are they national issues? I think for a long time, it was sort of assumed, especially for Democrats in more rural, traditionally red states, just focus on the local issues and maybe you can, break through on those. But I think that a combo of Trump's cult of personality and also just the internet, nationalizing everything, maybe all politics isn't as local as they once said. What are your thoughts on that?
Yeah, I think to your point, Dylan, it's a bit of a combo, right? Trump is just diving in the polls, right? It's just, we've never had a president like him, right? And hopefully we never will again. Um, my view, and I keep pounding this in my writings and stuff, it's a combination of meta, it's the corruption stupid, back in it's the economy stupid days of Bill Clinton, right? It's like it's the corruption stupid, but it's taking that major corruption on a federal level, on a meta level, and connecting it to the local issues that have direct impact on people.
Mhm.
One of my I'm convinced that people vote on what they perceive directly impacts them in their lives. Right now, Democrats have a way of saying, well, people are voting against their best interest. But the truth is, I don't think that's the way it is. People think they're voting in their best interests. It's just that they've been convinced that culture war issues and trans people and little brown people scurrying across the border in immigration it's in their best interest to vote against that. And they put the economic and other issues aside because they've been sort of told that this is what they should be concerned about, right? So
Yeah.
it's a matter of how do we convince them that other things are in their direct interest that have direct impact. So it's a combination. It's like taking the corruption. Ossoff's doing a great job on this. He's talking about corruption, but then he's directly, connecting it to the cost of healthcare, the cost of grocery, the cost of, of gas, things in his state in Georgia. So not easy, but I think it's the way to go.
One thing that I've observed a lot is among these sort of low information voters who are going to make their decision, the week before the election. One thing that always polls very well with them is term limits for politicians. This concept that everybody in Washington or state government is, sort of getting fat on the backs of the people, and they're being left behind. So I can see how corruption ties to that. The thing that I personally worry about is that people, low information people, are aware that Trump is this way, but they just assume that everyone is this way, and it's just more public with Trump.
Yeah.
And so you say, oh, Trump's taking Qatari bribe jets and running crypto scams. Well, I'm sure the Democrats are too. They just haven't, been outed or whatever. And I fear that sometimes that people just project that bad behavior onto the other side as well.
I think people pretty much do. And I think that's been a tactic of Republicans for a long time, right? Is to muddy the waters, right? Flood the zone, Bannon's flood the zone type of
Yeah.
thing. But I think there are breakthrough issues on corruption. The East Wing of the White House, right? The Qatari jet. Um, you know, Even stuff as small as the reflecting pool, right? Which, $14 million or $15 million, whatever it was on a no bid contract is irrelevant in the scheme of a $7.8 trillion federal budget, but people get it, right?
Yeah.
And I think those are the types of issues where you can point and say, look, we took this Qatari jet, we're spending $1 billion on the Qatari jet, it's not even secure, right? And that $1 billion means that you can't get healthcare, affordable healthcare coverage, or you know what, your gas prices are higher than they should be. However, you make the connection. Um, I think we try to avoid the all sides do it argument because then we're playing defense, right? I'm a sports guy, and some other folks that are sitting and listening on this podcast probably know this about me, but I've always looked at it as you want to play with a home field advantage. And in sports, teams that have the home field win way more than they lose. And then when you're playing away games, you lose more than you win. So the question is, what's a home game look like in politics? And to me, that means you're talking about the issues you want to talk about, the issues
Yeah.
that you think matter to people, and you're not defending yourself against other things. So, in terms of your all sides are corrupt view, it may be out there. I'm not so sure it helps us to bring that up and to try to defend it as strongly as some others might.
Well, let me. I think on the issues, there's no doubt the Democrats get to play offense on a lot of issues, mainly because Trump has sort of inflicted upon himself and his party. But when we talk about the home field advantage, one thing that stands out in this Senate cycle is how many Republicans are on their home turf. We're talking about states that have been red for a while: Ohio, Iowa, Texas, Alaska, in addition to, Maine, which is mostly a blue state, North Carolina, which seems legitimately purple. My question to you, you have run for office in, just about the reddest state in terms of how they vote for president. But my question is this: so much of what we see from Democratic candidates, including what like consultants from Washington are telling them to do, is to like downplay the party brand and to focus on themselves as individual. Is that needlessly defensive and like apologizing for oneself? Should Democrats actually embrace their brand more? You think about like the corporate advertising world, who succeeds hiding from what they are. It's not very common. So what are your insights on that as a place that where just being a Democrat sometimes means you have to be defensive about
Yeah, that's a great question. By the way, Wyoming is absolutely the reddest state in the
it. Yeah.
country by voter registration party differential. So
Hmm.
it was a challenge. And just on a side note, I think the way to overcome those challenges in deep red states is to get in front of people, right? For me, it was door to door. But however you do that in a personal way, I couldn't meet every single person in Wyoming. I think if I did, I would have won. I mean, my first race was one of the closest, maybe I think the closest House race in the country in that cycle. I lost by 0.3 or 4%. So, um, you know, letting people know who you are makes a big difference. But to your question, I never downplayed my party affiliation. And I think one of the problems that Democrats historically have had is their, I don't know if unwillingness is the right word, but their tepidness at defending their values and their views. And Obamacare was a great example. I mean, Dems passed Obamacare by a single vote, basically. And then they didn't really step up and defend it on a regular, consistent basis, with some pretty simple ways to do it. Like, look, I just want everyone in this country to have basic quality, affordable health care. End of story. That's it. That's what we're trying to do. Um, and I think, it's been a problem. And I think we have a collective issue of being a little wimpy when it comes to standing up for what we believe in. Now, I do think there are ways to talk about issues. I've mentioned this before, but my first time I ran, I know it's crazy, but wolves, reintroduction of wolves in northwest corner of Yellowstone, et cetera, was a huge issue because we're an ag state. Ranchers don't like wolves. They
No.
exterminated them once. Um, and so, how do you talk about that issue, right? If you feel like it's a good thing to do. From my perspective, the way I talked about it, I wasn't like I'm a tree hugger and we need wolves roaming all over the place. I made it kind of a states' rights issue. My view was, look, we don't want wolves roaming down the main streets of Casper and Riverton and Cheyenne and Laramie. But if we don't do it right, the feds are going to come in and tell us how to do it. And we in Wyoming don't want the feds telling us what to do in our lives. So let's do it right, because otherwise it's not going to work for us. Right. So you make it kind of a different issue. There's ways to frame messages without being hypocritical or without giving up on what you truly believe in. But at the end of the day, look, we believe in, I think our policy issues are popular, right? So why shy away from them? Whether it's healthcare or education, or inequality. I mean, I think, my view is climate change is the existential issue for the world, but inequality is the existential issue for our country, gross inequality. Let's talk about that. Let's talk about corporatism and taxes and those types of things, and own them.
Well, your tactic with the wolves, though, also did. It seems like that is some localization as well, right? Because I think in the Mountain West generally, but especially rural Mountain West, uh, states' rights, independence, keeping certain federal agencies out, Bureau of Land Management out or whatever is a really salient local issue.
Right.
Um, so it seems that you couldn't fully run on like a national platform of, say, healthcare and progressive taxation, right? There's got to be that local
Well,
flair.
I think you can absolutely run on those issues, but it's
Mm.
also important for people in your district, whether it's a statewide district or whether it's a house district or whatever, um, to know that you know what's going on in their lives on a local level, right? I
Yeah.
mean, you know, I'm going to bring up Mamdani because I think he's proving the point. Although his latest steps with Israel were probably unnecessary, but that's a whole other story. But he does small things like he took a some soccer fields in Brooklyn. I don't know if you saw this, Dylan,
Mm.
and he opened them up to being open 24/7 with
Did see
lights,
that. Did see
right?
that. Yeah.
And it's incredible how many people stepped up and were playing soccer at 3 in the morning with their local clubs and their local teams because they work during the day, right? And they don't have the time to do it. And people are recognizing that he knows what they're going through in their lives, and he's trying to do the things that matter to them, even if it's such a small thing like that. And so I think it's really important for candidates to know their districts, right?
Yeah.
And to speak to their districts. But they can speak to them in certain ways. And, I think wolves were one of those issues. Clean air and clean water, another kind of big environmental issue in Wyoming. My approach to that was, look, if you want to hunt, right? Hunting's huge in Wyoming, right? You know,
Mhm.
dads take their kids. I mean, it's like a rite of passage. So if you want to take your kids out and have healthy game herds, you need clean air and you need clean water. End of story, right? So let's take care of our environment so that we can do the things we love to do here, right?
Yeah.
So you're taking a national issue and you're localizing.
Well, one thing that I think Mamdani has really impressed a lot of people that not only was he a great campaigner and communicator, but that he's really figured out a way to, effect change almost from the moment he got into office. Now, one thing about him, of course, is he's in an executive role, and
Yeah,
he has that. He's figured out what powers the mayor has. I will give, even though I don't like how he does this at all, but Donald Trump, I will give him credit that he has spent time thinking about what can I do as an executive, what levers can I pull. Now, a lot of these are like legally and
right.
constitutionally questionable, but he's also taking advantage of a deadbeat Congress that can't do anything. But this to pivot to the Congress, one issue that we have, and I'd be curious about what you think, congressional Democrats have been doing and what they can be doing, but a huge problem with all that is that they aren't executives. They have to either have majority votes or super majority votes, in the Senate, and it just seems so hopelessly stagnant. And so, my question to you is: one, what do you think of how Democrats are acting right now in the minority? Should they be doing something more? What can they be doing more? And two, what should they do if all these Senate races and House races fall as we hope, and they get majorities, but they're not going to be massive majorities? What are your thoughts on the present and future of congressional Democrats?
Yeah, good question. I want to step back to Mamdani real quick and just say
Sure.
there's one other thing that he's brought, which I do think makes a difference. And it's he clearly loves his job, he loves his city, and he's bringing joy to doing what he does. And people see that. And, you don't have to be a stone faced politician
Mm-hmm.
to get ahead. And if you can really show that you care, that makes a difference. So that's just a little side
Yeah.
note. Um, but to your point, I've been very critical of the Schumers and Jeffries of the world, and the way I've looked at it, I've sort of said we've now got institutionalists, and we've got sort of, muckrakers is the way I'll put it, right?
Mm.
People that really want to get into the nitty gritty in the dirt and make a difference in a quick way. Um, and I still think that the institutionalists are trying to they're happy enough just trying to ride on the anti-Trump wave,
Mm-hmm.
and that's strong. There's no doubt about it. I just don't think it's enough. Number one, and number two, it's not the opportunity. It's not seizing the day. It's not taking chances with the opportunity. And look, my view, half our country, maybe more, is desperate. They're struggling. It's the system is not working for them. And they are looking for people that are willing to really step up and do some maybe out of the box things and do them quickly. Right now, you're right. Congress is not an executive branch, so they don't have the ability to really kind of run things per se. I think Dems need to come up with some really interesting ideas, and maybe out of the box, and vote on them right away. Right? I mean, there was
Mm-hmm.
Newt came up with the contract with America years ago.
Right.
Right? It made a difference in that election in a big way. It was the first time the House flipped in like 40 years or whatever it was, right? We don't necessarily need a contract with America, but we need some ideas that will stick and hold and that we will act on immediately. And I do think that a bunch of those can relate to corruption, right?
Mm-hmm.
Taking votes on everything from whether people in Congress and the president can trade stocks, trade crypto, whatever the case may be, to other ways to sort of rein in corruption, rein in no bid cronyism, whatever the case may be. So I think they need to show people very quickly that they're serious about governing. And I was bringing this up with Beshear in Kentucky, and I've had some pushback on it, and that's fine. That's great.
Mm-hmm.
Um, but at the end of the day, we don't know where Mitch is, right?
Right.
Um, honestly, I mean, he might be dead, he might
Yeah.
be alive, but non-functional. We don't know, right? August 3rd is a deadline for a special election. After that, I think the Kentucky legislature gets to make their choice for Senate,
Right.
right? My view is that Beshear now is sending these letters to McConnell, right, and to McConnell's office, which demand that they do X and demand that they proof of life and all these other things. I'm like, these guys have been ignoring you for years. What do you think? Because you're now sending a demand letter that they're all of a sudden going to change what they're doing? They're not, right? So what if you provisionally stepped up and say, we have no proof that, McConnell is compos mentis, and therefore I'm going to provisionally appoint someone to the Senate,
Mm.
right? Or I'm going to provisionally start the mechanism for a special election. And if we get proof otherwise, fine, great. Then we'll let things run as they are. But we can't function this way, and the people of Kentucky shouldn't be functioning this way and shouldn't be held hostage this way. Taking specific steps, even if it seems a little bit outside the bounds at times, are things I think Dems need to do because they're viewed as weak. I mean, we know that. We see that in the polls.
But here's my concern, whether it's about that specifically or to your earlier point about they should, if they retake power, introduce a series of anti-corruption bills that are great. My fear is that all of this is pure symbolism because, to go back to the corruption bill, let's say that they introduce it, it narrowly passes the House with their narrow majority, and then it gets filibustered in the Senate, and it's dead, and nothing happens. I just I really worry about that on a more fundamental level. If all they can do, not to mention that the president will remain a Republican for 2 more years, whether that's Trump or he chokes on his final cheeseburger and it's JD Vance, whatever it is, there's still not a lot of power to be had until 2029 because could this all just be symbolism? Even if you replace Mitch and it's still, a Republican majority or filibuster
Right.
majority. That's what I worry
I
about.
think that's totally valid, Dylan. And I think the answer to that is Democrats need to be honest with the American people, right? I think that they need to stand up and say, look, we get that the system isn't working. We get that most people in this country are struggling and in some ways are desperate and are looking for real, significant, immediate, direct change. We get
Yeah.
that, right? And the way to start this is to the people running the show, clearly you're not happy with them. So the way to start this is change, right? Is to elect new people to come on in and see what we can do. Right now, we know that we're limited because we have a president who's a Republican president for 2 years, who's incredibly unpopular. But we are going to do everything in our power to protect the American people and make decisions on behalf of the American people. And we'll let you know when we think we can get things accomplished and when we can't. Right? I mean, I think people underrate just transparency and honesty as something that most Americans want and they can sniff it out too.
Yeah, and to that point, Democrats have been very weak on messaging for a long time. Part of it was just that the president was Joe Biden, who once was a okay, orator, but he really wasn't toward the end. But he used to be pretty loquacious, and he just couldn't make the case. I will push back a little on. I am willing to draw a distinction between Schumer and Jeffries at this point. Hakeem Jeffries has never been Speaker of the House. He's only been Minority Leader. Um, I would like to see what he's able to do when he actually has power. I do think he's a much clearer communicator, as you are saying. Schumer, on the other hand, I think people say, oh, he should do more. I actually understand to some degree procedurally. There's only so much he can do in
Yeah.
the minority and with people like John Fetterman foisted upon him, who are just going to cause problems. But I think that in terms of communicating, explaining, as you said, this transparency, I find him to be monstrously a creature of Washington who doesn't believe that transparency does him any good. He seems way past his expiration date in a way that I personally would give Jeffries a little more leeway to see what he could do with power. What are your thoughts on that, or do you group them together?
Yeah, I think that's fair. I think there are different views. I've met Schumer. I spent time with him. Um, he liked me because I was originally from New York. Um, a
Yeah.
host of other reasons. I think his expiration date has come and gone, for
Yeah.
better or worse. There's a difference between being the minority leader and being the loyal opposition. And I think, Schumer and fellow senators, and there are some senators out there who are acting as the loyal opposition. I like Chris Van Hollen. I like Senator Whitehouse. There's a bunch of others I could name probably that I think are pretty good. But
Ron
we
Wyden.
need, yeah, yeah, absolutely. But they need to message that better, right? And it's no longer go along, get along. I mean, when Schumer makes a comment about, well, I hope that my friends across the aisle will someday come around to understanding X, Y, and Z. It's
Yeah.
like we are so far past that point, right?
Yeah.
That's never going to happen. So let's reframe the way we're saying things. I think Jeffrey's really maybe some of it's stylistic. He's kind of really low key and really sort of the way he talks about things, he doesn't really show passion from my perspective, number one. And you're right, he's never been the leader of the House, but I mean, look at who the people are that are popular in this country, whether it's AOC or, um, Jasmine Crockett, right? Or Raskin, who I love. They're a little bit of bomb throwers. They're a little bit of, they're throwing some fire, and people want to see that. They want to see that passion, and they want to see that resistance. And
Yeah.
and I think you need a little bit more. So I'm willing to give him some slack, but he's gotta show us he can do it.
Yeah. Well, I think that there's two different skills, right? There's some that's the behind the scenes wrangling, and then there's communicating to the public. It doesn't necessarily have to be the same person. I think in the case of, yeah, both of them, they're less than adequate in terms of communicating to the public, particularly Schumer, in my opinion. But the behind the scenes wrangling, we don't know as much. Pelosi was a lousy public speaker.
Yeah.
But she did wrangle her caucus in a way that we've seen Mike Johnson cannot. We've seen, we saw that McCarthy before him could not, et cetera. So there's something to be said for the behind the scenes skills. But
I
yeah,
was going to bring up Pelosi because I spent a fair amount of time with her as well.
yeah,
They made me red to blue in my second race for the House.
yeah,
And I tell people, you know what? She was not a firebrand by any stretch of the imagination, but she was more on top of her caucus and more on top of issues and events during her heyday than anyone else I met in DC. Right.
yeah,
And you need that, right? You need
yeah,
that behind the scene. You need to be able to count your caucus and get them all together and do what you need to do. These are slightly different times. It's not that you don't still need that, but I think we need some vocal, visible, strong presence that I worry, although we haven't seen the proof in the pudding yet, that Jeffries isn't quite there.
yeah. Yeah, well, we'll find out if he's given a majority, and we hope he will be. So if let's look at a few uh, uh, specific specific states that maybe we can talk about that would get Democrats to that majority. One that resembles yours a little bit is Alaska. Alaska mostly votes Republican, not to the degree that Wyoming does, but Alaska is a rural ag state, also a lot of tourism. But what would be your hopes for how Mary Peltola could prevail in Alaska?
I think in her case, she needs to tie Sullivan to to Trump, right? And sort of the national issues that that we're dealing with right now from an affordability perspective. And, affordability is such a bad word, but I've tried to think of other words to come up with. But, just the struggle, the, the struggle of the American people to survive and just make it economically, right? There's a whole bunch of stuff regarding oil and gas development, energy development that she should be talking about, and I don't honestly know enough about those issues up in Alaska and how people view them in terms of ANWR and the North Slope and the Alaskan Fund that they get money from every year, et cetera. But to me, if I'm Patola, again, deal with whatever the local issues are that matter, but at the same time, tie Sullivan to a complicit Republican caucus that will do anything that Donald Trump says, and that's impeding the ability of the American people to get the basics that they want and need to have a productive life, which means
Yeah,
health care and affordable gas, food, etc. Um, you know, and I will admit I'm not up on every single issue in Alaska, right? I mean,
yeah,
in terms of what's super important to them. They got tribal issues as well. I don't know how strong the tribal vote is up there, and whether tribes do show up to vote. I know that in Wyoming, we have a big reservation, the Wind River Res.
yeah.
Probably 95% of the people in that res would vote for a D if they voted, but it's been super hard to get them to turn out.
Mm.
So there's dynamics up there that I'm probably not fully up on.
Yeah. Well, you mentioned though, leaning into just Trump's corruption and negative perception of him, and that's in a pretty red state. I'm curious, living in a red state as you do now. You're in Jackson Hole. It's definitely not
Yeah.
the reddest part of the state, but I mean, do you see diminished enthusiasm, a diminished aura around Trump compared to this time last year?
I think it's diminished, but not enough.
Yeah.
I would say that, Wyoming would still vote for Trump, would be
Yeah.
my view, if he was up for election tomorrow, right?
Yeah.
And they would probably still do it in a maybe not 70-30 way, but in a 60-40 way, right? So it's chipping away at the margins.
Yeah.
And when I ran, to me, it wasn't. Look, the hardest thing when I first ran. I hadn't been a politician. I hadn't worked my way up through the system, so to speak. So a lot of it was new to me, and I would go door to door, and I would get in discussions slash arguments with what we would now call MAGA folks, and it turns out you're never going to get those people. So you have to make that decision to understand that when you knock on someone's door, and the first thing they say is, you suck, you're a Democrat, and I'm MAGA, whatever, right?
Yeah.
Instead of wasting time, you politely say thanks, appreciate it, and go to the next door, right? And find the persuadable voters. And I think for Democrats, whether it's in Alaska or Wyoming, Wyoming's going to take time.
Yeah.
But states like Alaska or even Ohio or Iowa that were more purple states and have gone a little bit red over time, but maybe we can shift them back. I think you go for the margins, right? You go
Yeah.
for those persuadable voters, and you don't overemphasize Trump per se, but I think talking about corruption in general, right, and the support that Republicans have given that corruption can make progress.
Do you,
We're threading a needle.
well, when you say MAGA in Wyoming, do you sense that Republicans there have radicalized in the way that they have in other states? It seems like most of what Trump talks about has little to do with Wyoming issues. I mean, it's not a border state. It's not. Yeah, I'm just curious what are they radicalizing and why when he basically ignores the state?
Well, it's really interesting because historically speaking, Wyoming was very much of a libertarian Republican state,
Yes.
right? I mean, we had an amendment on abortion. It's been 10, 15 years now, right? But it went down in flames because it
Yeah.
essentially was like, stay out of my life,
Yeah.
right? I mean, it went anti-abortion amendment, right? And it went
Yeah.
down. But if you look at our House caucus right now in the state legislature, it is dominated by the Freedom Caucus,
Hmm.
right? We are the only state in the country where the Freedom Caucus actually is governing. right?
Mm.
And they've had that for the last couple of cycles, and there's been an incredible backlash against that. And August 18th is the primary here in Wyoming, and I think there's a really solid chance that a fair amount of those Freedom Caucus state ledge House members and Senate members get voted out in their primaries.
Hmm.
So, I think that they've shown that they don't know how to govern. And the things that they want to do in governing, they've taken, national issues, brought them into Wyoming, and the people of Wyoming are like, we don't really care about that. We care about
Hmm.
what's happening in our state.
Yeah.
So, the fact that Trump has ignored Wyoming, look, we're the least populated state in the country,
Hmm.
right? There's 500, 600,000 people here, not quite 600,000. We probably, I'm going to get in trouble here. Not that we should be ignored, but we don't really have the critical mass to be focused on as a state,
Yeah. Yeah.
right?
Well, I live in
But
Los Angeles. That's one sector of the city is 600,000. So,
exactly,
yeah.
exactly, right? I mean,
Yeah.
look, and to me, there's other issues that I think we can talk about. You going back to being not an executive and looking at legislative people. We need to talk about the filibuster. We need to talk about SCOTUS reform. Supreme Court reform. To me, those are two. If I'm a Democrat, those are non-negotiable issues, and I think there are issues we need to bring up. The filibuster is not in the Constitution. It's all it is an anti-democratic mechanism that allows the minority party to stifle what the majority wants. End of story,
Yeah. Yeah.
right? That's not the American way. So let's talk about fixing that, right?
Yeah.
And same with the Supreme Court, right? Let's talk about it, reforming the court, whether it's term limits on the court or whether it's more districts, right? There's 13 districts now, judicial districts.
Yeah.
We have had changes in the number of Supreme Court justices in our past. Let's bring it, let's modernize it, right?
Yeah.
So I think there are some things you can talk about to go back to legislative versus executive that people will get, but you need to break through. And the problem is you don't know I don't think people realized that the East Wing was going to break through the way it did, right? That
Hmm.
demolition of the East Wing was going to matter to people. Like, why would it? But it seemed to, it really resonated for a while, right?
Perhaps
What are
because
those?
there's a tangible visual, as you say. The
Right.
budget for a lot of these things is statistically 0% in a multi-trillion-dollar budget, but that visual can make a big difference.
Look, inequality, billionaires. I ask people this question all the time. This is the test, Dylan. It's your
Hmm.
first test. Don't do the math. Just give me your quick response.
Yeah.
Elon Musk is worth $500 billion, roughly. Okay, let's
Yeah.
just say. If you make $1 million a year and you get to keep it all, how many years will it take for you to have $500 billion?
$1 million a year. It would take what, 5,000 years?
500,000 years.
500,000 years. Yeah. Yeah.
Nobody should have
Yeah.
that much money,
Yeah.
and nobody should have that much influence.
Yeah.
And I think that's something that everyday Americans get,
Yeah. Yeah.
right? So
Yeah.
so let's talk about how do we deal with the upper end, higher end taxation
Yeah.
and corporate taxation, which is the lowest that it's been. In our heyday in the 50s, 60s, and 70s, we had tax rates that were 90% on the highest earners.
Yeah.
I don't know that we need to go there, but 30-ish% doesn't work.
Yeah. I think a lot of people also overestimate how much they're making relative to other people, and they think that taxes on high earners are going to affect them, and a lot of them wouldn't be
Right.
effective. Yeah.
Yeah,
Well,
I agree.
I think that's a long laundry list of things to get back with the people. I think it varies state to state, as you say. There's some places, Wyoming, it's going to take a long time. There might be other places where, at least for this cycle, Texas, Ohio, Alaska, maybe there's enough to tip it for now. But but work to be done.
I think generally speaking, just to go back to the higher level, my view as someone who really has done retail campaigning in 3 different campaigns, and by the way, I ran twice for House, came very close both times. Thought I was done, went back to real life, raising a family, working in the private sector, etc. And then my kids basically convinced me to run again after Trump got elected in 2018. And I ran against Barrasso and I got destroyed, right? Because the world had changed
Mm.
in that 10-year period in terms of polarity and, just MAGA and the uprising of the Tea Party and all that other stuff.
Yeah.
So, the question is back to the point of what should Dems be doing? I think they should be more strong, right? Because we are viewed as weak in standing up for what we believe in, not being afraid to speak up on our issues and back our issues, whether it's inequality and whatever it takes to reduce inequality, whether it's healthcare, like basic quality, affordable healthcare for everybody, whether it's the price of gas and food and corruption or whatever the case may be. Um, you know, be strong. Don't be afraid, right? I mean, we need to take some risks, and I think that goes back to our party in general. Even though we're riding a little bit of a wave, seemingly right now, on anti-Trump wave, I think we need to take some risks to step out and show people who we are and what we're willing to do. And that's not easy, and it's complex, and each state's different, and each district is different. But I think there are some similarities that we can all pull together on.
Well, that's some bold advice from someone who's done it. Gary Trauner, I think that a lot of your fellow Democrats would agree. It is time to go bold. It is time to take on the perception that we're just going to roll over for Trump and actually show a little spine here. So we will.
And then lastly,
Yeah.
lastly, Dylan, I'm sorry, I didn't mean it, but just to get back, like open, honest, and transparent, right? Just
Yeah.
be people. In my campaigns, I realized when I got in front of people in rooms, in meet and greets at their doors, that if you start dissembling a little bit, if you try to sort of triangulate on what you think people want to hear, they get that. They may be ignorant about issues, they may not pay a lot of attention, but they can smell out authenticity.
Yeah.
So I think being authentic, acknowledging it's not working, acknowledging we haven't done a great job either. We've
Yeah.
done some good things. We've got some good laws passed over the years, but we're not perfect. But saying, look, we don't have an option here, right? The way
Yeah.
things are going right now is not working. We get that, right? We need change.
Yeah. Well, I hope that message cuts through. And between now and the election, we'd love to have you back, Gary, and just keep assessing as election day ticks ever closer, and then beyond.
Well, thanks for having me, Dylan. Really
Yeah.
appreciate it. It's
Yeah.
an honor to be
Yeah.
on, and I'd love to come back and have people agree, disagree, but this is the fun part.
Yes, it is. Well, thank you again, Gary, for joining us on Personality Crisis. We'll see you next time.
Thanks, Dylan.